This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Your Excellency, colleagues, friends, I'd just like to extend a welcome to you on behalf of the Institute of Latin American Studies, and I particularly like to welcome those people who've made the journey across the Atlantic and probably still suffering from a bit of jet lag. So you're really welcome indeed, and thank you so much for giving up the time to come with us. This conference really is the sort of, its inspiration is here on my left, Alan Charlton, who a few years ago suggested we might actually hold a conference on the British in Brazil, and we held a conference 2 years ago, which was so successful, I think, that we decided that we'd have another one. And what we decided this time was to try and draw in a few new early career scholars. I mean, Leslie will tell us a little bit more about, what the aim of the conference is. So it's slightly different emphasis, but still continuing the theme that we started some time ago. And I'd also like to thank Leslie, who's been instrumental in drawing up the programme. Also thanks very much to the Brazilian Embassy for supporting this event, to the Foreign Commonwealth Office, who also have supporting this event, and I expect that a representative from the Foreign Commonwealth Office will be with us later today. I'm not going to take up much more time. There are a few sort of housekeeping notices. If there's a fire alarm, which there probably won't be, the one that you may have heard already this morning is the test which normally happens on a Thursday morning at 9:30. But basically you just leave the same way that you came in through here. If you need to have Wi-Fi, the password here is on the wall. And finally, the Institute received visitation from the Ambassador of FUNAG, earlier the year, Sergio Moreira Lima, and he asked us if we could actually publicise the existence of a sort of virtual library that exists on their website, where you can find lots of digitised books free, basically on Brazilian international relations and diplomatic history. So you can get them free online. You can also buy them. And we've just left some promotional literature for that, if you're interested in looking at. There are titles not only in Portuguese in that library, but also some books and theses in English, so you might be of interest to you. So I'm not going to say very much more. I won't unfortunately be able to be here all the time. I have an important meeting at British Academy in the middle of the day, but I will be here for the first part, and I'll be coming back later. So I just wish you a very productive and indeed enjoyable day. And just to say, those of you who are gasping for coffee, that coffee will be served just after the first speaker. Alan, Leslie, do you want to say a few words?
Yes, thank you, Linda. Just to say that, as Linda said, this is the second conference looking at all aspects of the relationship between Britain and Brazil. We set out to cover as much as possible, on not just political and economic, but social, cultural, and intellectual relations. Starting, I guess, in 1808, with the transfer of the Portuguese court to Rio, under British protection, and the events leading to the independence of Brazil in 1822, and the role played by Britain in recognising Brazil's independence. Clearly, most of our focus will be on the 19th century, up to the First World War, because this is the period when Britain was the principal trading partner of Brazil, and virtually the only source of capital, both in terms of loans and direct investment. And the British had a considerable political and social and intellectual influence in Brazil, not least because of the existence of small but important British communities, and a whole series of interesting and sometimes important visitors from Britain to Brazil who recorded their impressions of Brazil. So the 19th century is obviously the core of any historical study of the relationship between the two countries. But we obviously want to look at the period from the First World War to the Second World War, when the British position went into relative decline, was still important in trade and in capital, in terms of capital, and also the number of visitors from Britain still going to Brazil and writing about Brazil, and artists and photographers from Britain going to Brazil. But obviously between the First World War and the Second World War, the story is one of the increasing and increasingly successful replacement of British hegemony by United States hegemony. And after the Second World War, as we all know, the British largely abandoned or certainly neglected Brazil, but not completely. Even in the period after 1950, when the British disinvested in Brazil, a number of key companies continued to operate in Brazil, but on a much lower scale. And then in the 1990s, since the 1990s, right up to the present day, there have been signs of a revival of British commercial, financial, and political interest in Brazil. And we now have a large Brazilian community in the UK. And first in Oxford and now at King's College London, we've had the development of Brazilian studies in British universities. So there's a lot to be said, and Alan Charlton will say something about the Conversa, an attempt to bring British politicians, diplomats, businessmen, academics together on an annual basis. So that's the framework that we have. The first conference in May, I think, of 2014, we invited speakers, and they were mostly established scholars, the old lags, people who've been working on Britain and Brazil most of their careers. We had 9 from British universities, though 2 of them were Brazilian, 2 from the United States and 1 from Brazil. And then the decision was taken by Alan and Linda that we could do another conference, at least one more, maybe perhaps more. But the second conference, we did a call for papers, hoping to attract younger scholars that we maybe didn't even know were writing on aspects of Britain and Brazil. And we've pulled together a very interesting program. 1 or 2 established scholars still, but the majority are now either doctoral students or post-doctoral researchers from British universities, 2 from the United States, 2 from Brazil, both from USP, and 1 from Denmark. So it's a very different lineup that we have today. And we're going to try and look at the papers being grouped together, the British in Brazil, economic relations between Britain and Brazil, both trade and investment, the Brazilians in London, in the UK, educational and cultural relations between Britain and Brazil, and political relations between Britain and Brazil. So that's the menu, and that's what we're trying to do in this second conference.
Well, thanks very much, Leslie, and thank you very much, Linda, for all you've done, you and your staff in organising this. I haven't a great deal to add, except that it did strike me very much when I was British ambassador in Brazil that there was an awful lot in terms of the relationship between Britain and Brazil, both historically and current, that simply was not being studied and researched, and certainly was not known. I was always hitting upon traces of this in everyday life in various parts of Brazil, and as an avid consumer of the result of the kind of research you people are doing, I think I am the most fortunate person here, because this conference will certainly shed a lot more light on a number of aspects that are fascinating to me. As Leslie said, in my mind anyway, this is one very important part of the relationship between Britain and Brazil, that there is a thriving and forward-leaning research effort being made into aspects of the relationship. But there is obviously a contemporary aspect. We're very fortunate to have the Brazilian ambassador, Eduardo Santos, here, who obviously is very much involved in that relationship today, as indeed the British ambassador Alex Ellis in Brasilia is, and the two foreign ministers, the 2 commercial sides of the countries and many other sides as well. But for me, as an ex-ambassador, I obviously try to keep involved in Latin America and Brazil as I can, and one area is in at least trying to use this position I have been honoured with as an honorary fellow of ILAS to promote research, but also outside that to look at other areas where connections can be made. And as Leslie said, one area of this is the British-Brazilian Conversa, which brings together British and Brazilian people from political life, commercial life, scientific, educational, cultural life, to talk in a very serious way about the issues that are facing our countries and how to move forward. We had an event which was greatly supported by Eduardo dos Santos a couple of weeks ago in Rio de Janeiro, at a time when things are perhaps not going perfectly in Brazil, but nonetheless we had extremely good reception and were helped by the mayor of Rio being allowed to use the Palacio da Cidade, about which much could be written in terms of British Brazil history. We are hoping that next year we'll have a further event of this kind. So I see all these things as part of a wider whole in trying to make more of what is known of the British-Brazil relationship, and hopefully also to encourage and support those who are involved in the current relationship in developing it more. I've always had a very simple idea about Britain and Brazil, and indeed Britain and Latin America, is that if you're living in the UK, you tend to look out to sea, and you only have to look down there, and it's a neighbour. It's not so far away. It really isn't. Of course, those sea routes were very important in history, and the cultural and historical connections, I think, remain important to this day. And I look forward to this conference also adding to our sum of knowledge and enthusiasm about that relationship. So at that point, I suppose I ought to hand over back to Leslie to start our proceedings.
We'll have the first session. Thanks.
No, I'm going to move out the way so you can share. Yeah.
I think no more. Yeah. Okay.
Well, we're going to begin the conference with a paper from one of our more senior colleagues. Stephen Bell, who has degrees from Oxford and Toronto, is Associate Professor of Geography and History at the University of California, Los Angeles. He's a historical geographer by profession, and he's published an important book on the Brazilian ranching system, the Campanha Gaúcha, from Stanford University Press, and he has another book on Aimé Bonpland, who was Humboldt's companion in his travels in South America and moved on after Humboldt to southern South America. And he's been working for some time, as I understand it, on a historical geography of Brazil. But his research interest specifically and relevant to us is the work he's been doing on ranching and land development in Rio Grande do Sul, Santa Catarina, and Paraná, and the role of the British. And he's used several accounts by the British in this area as the basis for his research. And he's going to talk about the historical geography of British influence in southern Brazil from 1850 to 1950. Steve.
Thank you. I am hopeless.
No, I'm really hopeless.
No, not quite hopeless. Just about. So, well, I'm delighted to be here. and listening to the preamble comments, I reflect on my long interest in the British in Brazil. I wanted to write a PhD thesis on historical geography, some aspect of historical geography of Brazil when I finished my undergraduate degree, and it wasn't really obvious at the time as a geographer where in the UK one would do this, and I ended up in North America as a sort of transplant. And I was drawn to southern Brazil as a part of the country that didn't really have a very developed English language historiography, probably still doesn't in many ways, and wondered about, would I work on the state of Paraná, where there are various layers of British influence, most famously the Paraná plantations, Simon Fraser, Lord Lovat, but also the 19th century business of British emigration, a part of Brazil where people actually tried to settle. It was not successful, not too far from Curitiba. And that, of course, is the subject of a book by Oliver Marshall, written in the last 10 years, very detailed, well-researched book. And there were various other land development schemes involving British interests, capital, railway building, things like that, in Paraná. Ultimately, I went for what I felt was the more intriguing intellectual topic, the ranching zones of the southernmost Brazilian state of Rio Grande do Sul, and tried to look at the technological development of ranching in southernmost Brazil vis-a-vis the Rio de la Plata, Argentina and Uruguay. And some interesting things came out of that involving the British, that in Argentina and Uruguay one has very tight technical connections between things like zootechnics, breed improvement and so forth. There is some of this in muted form in Rio Grande do Sul, but it is truly muted indeed. It's a very different story from the Rio de la Plata, and if one goes back to the book Campagna Gaúcha, I try to explain why, as I see it, the role of cities. There is no Montevideo or Buenos Aires in Rio Grande do Sul. One has instead an urban network which is fragmented and which has been shifting over time. One has no concentration of Anglo-Brazilian influence which is consistent. In the 19th century, it's the story of Rio Grande. If I forget to mention it, I must remember that the oldest football club in Brazil came out of the city or town of Rio Grande, associated with the Lawson family, British merchant family, which acculturated relatively quickly, first generation, married daughter of part of the Brazilian nobility, and the Lawsons have been present in different parts of Brazil from 1860s, 70s down to the present. Rio Grande, the 19th century, there's a British community of some sort there. The processing of livestock products was undertaken not far away from Rio Grande in the town of Pelotas. And it's striking that despite the prosperity of 19th century Pelotas, there was no British community there whatsoever. And then, as the 19th century unfolds and we come into the 20th century, it becomes much more the story of Porto Alegre. Anyway, to begin, we might think about where is there still some tangible evidence of British cultural presence on the soil of southern Brazil, and we have here an image of the British Club in Porto Alegre, which was founded in 1923, and I got hold of an image of the president's list of the British Club, which sort of says something, I think, about this story of this shifting geographical influence across the state. The foundation is 1923, so it's not a 19th century foundation. One would have to dig out the records of some sort of foreigners' club for the port of Rio Grande to deal with the 19th century. And as one looks at the family names here in some rather crude way, right down to the Second World War, they all look like British names to me. And then come 1946, already we have what it may not be a British name. There's a broadening to involve other people of non-Luso-Brazilian European descent. In come eventually Germans, Russian Jews into this British club. We go all the way down to about 1982 to find the first Luso-Brazilian president of the British club, André Cione Lima, who was married to a member of the Lawson family, sort of these culturated British merchants who've become part of a Brazilian hybrid identity. There is no sort of Anglo-Argentinian, Anglo-Uruguayan equivalent in southern Brazil in terms of Anglo-Brazilian terms. And so that board of presidents says something that British influence was moving up from Rio Grande towards Porto Alegre in the 20th century. By the 1930s, the British banking presence in the port of Rio Grande had gone. It had moved up to Porto Alegre and so forth. So if one turns to the very limited English language literature on southern Brazil, there are not that many. I'm no doubt I'm missing something somewhere along the way. I don't want to talk to you about works as technical as Consul Henry Vereker's account of the difficulties of the port of Rio Grande do Sandbar, but he did publish a work outlining the sort of physical challenges of the coastline. I think there are three books that I'm aware of, and we'll start with Michael Mulhall from the 1870s, Rio Grande do Sul and its German colonies. Mulhall was editor of a Buenos Aires newspaper of Anglo-Irish background, and the book Rio Grande do Sul and its German colonies, which is a very quick read, as some 19th century works are, but a very interesting one in terms of all sorts of fragments of things now long forgotten. It deals principally with the remarkable story of the successes by the 1870s, the growing presence of German culture in the Serra of Rio Grande do Sul, but it does more than that. It begins in the port of Rio Grande. So this is not from Mulhall, it's the work of a German mercenary soldier, but an image of what Rio Grande looked like in the middle of the 19th century. And Mulhall was able to document some of what was present. He said, when you arrive in the 1870s, whatever side you turn to, you meet English engineers, some belonging to the waterworks, some to the gas company, some to the companies that were dredging the lagoons that front the Atlantic in this part of the Americas, some to the government enterprise for deepening the Rio Grande Bar, and as the bar meaning the sandbar, not a bar where one drank alcohol. And as a natural consequence, every stranger is immediately put down for an engineer. Nearly in front of the custom house is the shop of Messrs. Halliwell, chemists and druggists, a favourite rendezvous of strangers. The Foreign Club, with many windowed saloons of vast size and cool temperature, looks out upon the port and lake, commanding a view of the fertile Ilha dos Marinheiros and the aquatic suburb of São José do Norte. If it's difficult today to recuperate much of a visible record of the British in the port of Rio Grande, even more difficult in that aquatic suburb of São José do Norte, which is where most of the British community was concentrated. One can turn to Mulhall for a tour of where the British were present in Rio Grande do Sul in the 1870s, and those brief quotations I read emphasize so much of the presence is about engineering, it's about gas and laying in water lines, it's about coal mining, It's about steam yachts that were built on Clydeside and provided communication between the Atlantic coast, the provincial capital of Porto Alegre, some hundreds of miles removed from the Atlantic coast, and various rivers running into the interior of Rio Grande do Sul. And a record of that is pretty much today completely forgotten. When people sit down in the 20th century and try to recuperate the British presence, to retrieve it, you have to turn, above all, to consular reports, which are irregular in their frequency and uneven in their quality, and to the few travel accounts, such as Michael Mulhall. The second book has an extremely telling title. May Francis, a 25-year-old Englishwoman. I know very little about her. Some reference in the book makes me think there's a connection with southern England, with Surrey, but she went out to visit her brother, who was building a railway line in the southwestern corner of Rio Grande do Sul. So a book titled Beyond the Argentine or Letters from Brazil. I mean, obviously somebody decided that a book titled Letters from Brazil was not going to sell in 1890 English market, but the Anglo-Argentinian economic connection was already perhaps strong enough because of the railways and so on that one could think of a work of this sort. It's a rather valuable book in terms of providing a type of ethnography of interior life in Rio Grande do Sul. It has a lot of the limitations that many British works of this period do. It's highly judgmental and hierarchical and not particularly positive about Brazilian culture, especially Brazilian material culture, foodways and so forth. Contains a rather useful map and an interesting map which shows us that a lot of the communication between Rio Grande do Sul and the Atlantic coast. We've got two ways of doing this. There's the Atlantic itself, and that's where Rio Grande became important. One can think about the sea and the mercantile community of the port of Rio Grande, or the influence of the Rio de la Plata, the places like Buenos Aires, where you went by coasting vessel up the Rio Uruguay as far as Salto. Salto means falls or falls. The falls on the river had to be somehow addressed, and one way to do that was to build railway lines on both the Argentinian and the Uruguayan side around the falls. And so the Brazilian Great Southern Railway, going up towards Itaqui and eventually later extended to São Borja, birthplace of Getúlio Vargas, was part of a project that was broader than southwestern Brazil alone. So in Rio Grande do Sul, British influence is either is predominantly Atlantic, the port of Rio Grande, and eventually then with the growth of Porto Alegre, somewhat further north, based on the success of the German colonies, there's this shift, there's this transition with Pelotas, which is where most of the wealth was drawn from the ranching economy, not part of the story of the British direct presence at all. Of course, trade, merchant activity is part of the broader story, and then one has this riverine influence coming up the Rio Uruguay. The third book is not dealing with Rio Grande do Sul, it's Paraná. And if I talked about the sea and I've talked about the theme of river, I suppose in Paraná one has to start thinking about land. This, of course, is a state, a province rather, in the 19th century, which was not an independent political entity until 1853, or is it 1854? I forget which. It was part of São Paulo. It had a different history of settlement than Rio Grande do Sul. The ranching zones of the Campania were taken up formally by people by the end of the colonial period. Most of the Campania was handed out as Sesmaria land grants. Paraná, apart from some of the grassland zones where one had the mule trains that went from the far south, from Rio Grande do Sul, to supply the market of Sorocaba, Paraná, in the main, was a very lightly settled area indeed. I mean, a very late developing part of Brazil. So the third work, travel account, that I draw attention to is the work of Thomas P. Bigwither. Middle name was Plantagenet. Thomas Plantagenet Bigwither came out of an absolutely classic English landed family. A while ago, Country Life had an article about 2 or 3 ideal country houses in England, and the family, one of the residences of the Bigwithers, Tangier Park in Hampshire, came up there. There are literary associations with Bigwither. His grandfather was engaged to Jane Austen, and she broke it off. And his book, Pioneering in South Brazil, is supposed to have had an influence on Thomas Hardy, that the novel Tess of the D'Urbervilles, where the character Angel Clare goes off to Brazil, has maybe been influenced by this work, Pioneering in South Brazil. So Bigwither was, one member of a large family, the usual story where the eldest son inherits the land and everybody else has to find something else to do, the Anglican ministry or whatever. And in Thomas Bigwither's case, it was engineering, and he was called in to do survey work on a railway projected to cross the state of Paraná and run all the way to Mato Grosso. The sort of infrastructural development that would make an awful lot of sense, probably in Brazil in the year 2016, but has yet to happen. It didn't happen in the 19th century for all sorts of reasons, obvious reasons, lack of capital, lack of an obvious market for building such a thing, but considerable sums were spent on survey work, and out of a couple of years of travel into the western interior of the province of Paraná, Bigwither managed to write a 2-volume travel account. It is a deeply racist book, quite troubling on that score, but a very important book, I think, in terms of working out resource issues in Paraná, illustrated by some rather attractive plates. The iconic Araucaria pine of Paraná, which is a symbol of the modern day state. So image of things like a survey camp, and in the background some sense of the immensity of the Paraná pine stands going towards the far western interior of the province of Paraná. Map is not the easiest thing to interpret in a room like this, but the preparation of this deserves thanks, and it shows very clearly that Paraná was not simply one physiographic zone. Essentially, there are 3 key areas that part of it was forested. You have part of the old South Atlantic forest close to the Atlantic coast, the littoral. And then you have, in the middle of the state, huge areas of Campos Gerais, of natural grasslands. And then in the far western interior, we're back into a predominantly forested environment. He made the point, he said, many people in speaking and writing of Brazil as a country speak and write of it as though it had but one climate, Paraná, and offer but one kind of life to the emigrant or settler. In the province of Paraná alone, there are 3 well-defined divisions of climate and life, and the elevated prairie region alone sum to something like 20,000 square miles. So immense areas, territories open to potential development. Closer to the Atlantic coast, if one were to, and I realize you cannot see where Curitiba is, but it's on sort of eastern, not on the Atlantic coast, but at the head of the Serra, coming from the Atlantic coast, one had the capital of the province, Curitiba, today a major Brazilian city. And not very far away from Curitiba is where in the 1860s and 70s the failed colony of Assungui occurred in hilly district of difficult topography, again, the usual issue of colonization in southern Brazil of where were the markets going to be if you were able to produce any kind of commercial surplus of agricultural products. What Big Brother was doing was way over in the Ivaí and Tibaigi valleys, these vast zones over in the west, which would eventually become the framework for the development of the Paraná Plantations Company. So there are various layers of British presence in 19th century Paraná. There's failed colonization in Assungui. There were various emigration schemes, which Oliver Marshall does not mention in his book, very well researched book about Assungui, but notions of bringing tens of thousands of people to Paraná, the Quitolandia, as it was called, where basically unscrupulous people in the United Kingdom more or less duped Dom Pedro II into signing on to emigrant delivery schemes that never amounted to anything. And then one has in the 20th century Simon Fraser, Lord Lovat, on a financial mission in 1924, passed through the northwest corner of Paraná, was very interested indeed in cotton cultivation. That was the initial impetus for what became the Paraná Plantations Company. They moved instead to coffee, set up a colonization model which was distinctive across South America for its degree of careful design. Enormous impact upon the natural resources, of course, which is something that comes through in historiography today to greater degree. The impact on the natural environment, the impact on the native peoples was sort of not something much written in the earlier historical record. Now it tends to be. We're talking about an area eventually that involved the settlement of, as one British diplomat put it, an area the size of Yorkshire, and Yorkshire is England's largest county, I believe. So we're not talking about something inconsequential, involving around about 500,000 settlers, very few of whom were of British origin. The management was British, but there's not really much of a British cultural impress in all of this in terms of actual settlement or day-to-day life. So just a few images relating to this. Here is early Londrina, named after London in the early 1930s from a German book. But it's before the railway line arrived, so it's very early 1930s. And again, one has that sense of pushing back the forest frontier, I think, fairly clearly in the image. The company was nationalized during World War II as part of that complicated story of the expropriation in some cases and willing sale of British enterprise in Brazil. But some British cultural influence lasted a little bit longer. My predecessor at UCLA in the geography department, Professor Henry Bruman, cultural historical geographer, who worked on Mexico in the 1930s, but then was drafted into war work in Washington in World War II on colonization issues, emergency colonization, was given the task of writing a report on southern Brazil. And when he gained a university appointment, he decided it would be a worthwhile thing to study colonization to Brazil in the post-World War II world. He did an immense amount of field research and built excellent contacts, but unfortunately never published anything from it. However, leaves behind all manner of primary documentation. And here a letter from 1953 from the São Paulo office of what had become the Companhia de Terras Norte do Paraná, writing about the frost incidents and their enormous economic impact upon small-scale coffee farmers. The frost was a ghastly affair. Our managing director tries to minimize its effects, but I can tell you that hundreds have been ruined. I don't think that there was ever anything like it before, and it was even worse than the famous one of 1918. That letter is written by Gordon Fox Rule, who was an Anglo-Brazilian and a World War I flying ace. There are museum records, the RAF, for his what became the RAF, and his work in World War I. Fox Rule had a long career in Sao Paulo, working on behalf of the Companhia de Terras Norte do Paraná. So even after it was sort of sold out as a British enterprise following World War II, there's still some residue of British cultural influence in the management of the Brazilianized company. So, for instance, in the centenary of the what had become the state of Paraná, the sort of trade journal, in a sense, the Pioneer, the Pioneira, published normally in Portuguese, but had a go at trying to translate some of its work into English in '53. The portrait of a portrait, I suppose, of northern Paraná, this bi-monthly illustrated magazine. And as late as 1952, the British Foreign Office was sort of still conjuring the idea of having a stronger diplomatic presence in this part of Brazil, which was never going to go anywhere because there wasn't. British capital had been invested here, but there was no particular British community to speak to. How did you persuade consumers drawn from numerous ethnic backgrounds of the virtues of British products when the United States swept all away before it in that period? But a consul managed to argue that, he said, the hinterlands of Paraná possess a wealth which the visitor who judges the state by the sour uplands around Curitiba or the humid littoral, I cut out this part, but he said, ruined by the emancipation of slavery, which I thought was a very odd comment to make in 1952, could hardly imagine. So really a very positive image of this part of Brazil. So I wanted just to think a little bit about how historiography is unfolding. I, of British descent, from an agrarian background, working on ranching in Rio Grande do Sul, had obviously some obvious lines of interest in some of this, some of the inertias. Why is the largest herd of pedigree Devon cattle on earth not in anywhere in the UK in the early 20th century, or the United States, or Australia, or Argentina, but in Rio Grande do Sul, Brazil? Things like this intrigue me. The Anglophiles in Brazilian culture intrigue me somewhat, their own family histories, and so I've looked at this a little. But I have to say that 20 or 30 years ago, no one was really very interested in doing any systematic study of depth about mercantile enterprise, individual families, sometimes present for 3 and 4 generations. But now I see much of the potential is lying with the Brazilian Academy, that there are people who are willing to spend time doing research on individual elements of this British presence. So I think that the future for things that have left so few tangible traces, one struggles really to pull together any kind of visual record of what I'm talking about, is not an easy thing to do. I've tried, but there's not really a vast amount to work with. But I think the future lies very much with the Brazilian Academy to a large extent, and of course the internationalization of the interests. That it's not solely a matter of what the British people want to do, but trying to internationalize this whole matter, which I suppose is what this conference is very much trying to do. So I thank you for your patience. Thank you.